All right, guys, this is section 11, which is going to be our section on refugees. All right. So, in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights that we talked about in previous sections, there is a right to be a refugee, right? So, if you are fleeing an area or a country that has decided to commit violence against people like you, if you have a legitimate fear of returning, you have the right to resettle in other areas. Not an unlimited right, but you have the right to resettle in other areas. This is a big problem in human rights because these refugees are people that are kind of outside recognized law. This is kind of one of those cases where international law has to step in, because if they're being persecuted and fear legitimate violence in their own country, and they go to other countries, the law isn't always clear in those other countries how to treat people who aren't citizens, people from other places. So it can be very difficult to figure out what's legal, what's not legal. And that's one of those areas where international law really has to step in and kind of say, all right, this big group of countries, in this case the UN, let's all agree that we're going to treat refugees and asylum seekers with these certain rights and these certain ways of being, okay? Because of that being outside recognized law part, this being a refugee gets linked to lots of other human rights violations, right? Obviously, there's things like torture and slavery that happen to them if they stay or if they get sent back to where they come from. But even in their new countries, even the countries they're going to try to flee to, they have a tendency to have their due process rights overlooked. They have a tendency to be vilified. They have a tendency to be segregated. They have a tendency to, have their human rights not recognized by those host countries. There's different kinds of refugees, okay? The ones we're probably most familiar with are the international refugees, i.e. they live in country A, they're from country A, something happens there, whether it's a war, a genocide, some kind of political or religious persecution, and they try to flee country A to country B. That kind of international travel is usually, the vast majority of them go to neighboring countries, right? So if you're close to, so Afghanistan, the refugees from Afghanistan go to the countries surrounding Afghanistan, which there are numerous ones. But then in addition, there's also what's called internally displaced people. Okay, these are kind of refugees within their own country. So they're leaving one area or one province of a country and going to another because of, again, could be a war, could be an environmental disaster, could be some kind of local persecution, and they're being internally displaced. They're staying in the same country, but they're refugees from their area of the country. And then finally, there's stateless people. And stateless people is a really weird, interesting niche thing in international law, because occasionally there will be people that don't have a country. They don't have citizenship in any country. It's a relatively rare thing to happen, but there are still a lot of them out there, especially like post-World War II, when the Allies kind of carved up, especially the Middle East, but also most of the rest of the world, and said, okay, everybody who lives here is now this country, and everybody who lives here is now this country. When they created Israel, that created a lot of stateless people that had to flee as refugees to Jordan or some other neighboring country. The latest details I could find from the UN, as seen in this graph, are that there's roughly 65 million people that are refugees today. Okay, and this graphic breaks it down by refugees, which is what we're talking about when we say international refugees, internally displaced persons, and then asylum seekers, okay, which they separate out from other kinds of refugees. Roughly half of all these refugees are children. They're under the age of 18. They're following their parents, or even worse, they're refugees alone without parents. And they're attempting to find safety. They're attempting to find a place where they can live without being starved, without, where they can get clean water, where they can not have to fear being disappeared or tortured or any of those other horrible human rights violations. So a little bit about the history of refugees. There's essentially been refugees as long as there have been politics. I mean, as soon as the first ruler in human history came about and said, okay, I own this area now, soon afterwards, that ruler created the first refugees because people needed to leave that area for one reason or another, whether it's, being afraid that the king is going to kill them, or the king forces them to leave, or some other reason. In 1500 BC, there's actually a record of a Hittite king saying, hey, I'm welcoming refugees. Refugees can come and join my kingdom, and we can, you can live here. It's okay. People from the surrounding lands are welcome here. There's the famous story of the Hebrew flight from Egypt from the Old Testament, or the Talmud if you're Jewish, where this was where Moses said, let my people go to the Pharaoh, and I think Disney made a cartoon about it even. And then the Hebrews left Egypt and tried to find their own way and wandered for 40 years in the desert, and then finally found a place in what is now Israel. In France, in 1685, there were thousands of people who had to flee France because of essentially religious persecution, and try to find homes in neighboring kingdoms. The map of Europe looked different in 1685, so but there were numerous countries that surround France that they could kind of choose to go to. In the 20th century, this is where refugee problems really reached a huge, gigantic presence, both just through sheer numbers of people and through media exposure, and it kind of became really visible to people because we had photography and video and mass communications for the first time. One of the saddest stories when you're talking about refugees is this picture right here. This was a picture taken on the St. Louis. These were hundreds of Jewish refugees fleeing Germany in the 30s. They feared persecution, obviously, and so they came to the United States, and the United States says, no, we don't want to accept you, and they turned them away. They turned away these hundreds and hundreds of Jewish refugees. They went to a few other different countries in the Western Hemisphere, were turned away from all of them. So ultimately they had to go back to Europe, and roughly half of the people in this picture and on this ship were killed in the Holocaust by the Nazis. After the war, there's estimates that there were roughly 40 million refugees in the world, mostly because of World War II. World War II caused kind of unprecedented destruction, and there was not only the Nazi oppression of their groups, but at other places in the world there was similar political oppression going on, and that caused people to flee very quickly from one place to another. The Soviet Union was taking over Eastern Europe, so a lot of Eastern Europeans fled west. Lots of Germans had to flee Germany. Um, just all over the world, there were people being displaced. So in the late 40s, there were a lot of people that had to very quickly leave where they had lived their entire lives and try to find a life where they could be safe somewhere else. Um, Relatively soon after World War II, the Soviets invaded Hungary, and 200,000 Hungarians fled that country because they knew the Soviet rule of their country would essentially be very bad for them. The Korean War created about 5 million refugees. The Korean War was in the early 50s. This is where North Korea and South Korea split. North Korea, aided by China, invaded the South. South Korea, aided by the United States, fought back. The lines kind of went back and forth for a few years, and then they ultimately, in I believe 1953, declared essentially a ceasefire at the current lines, the dividing line between North Korea and South Korea. And that has stood for, what, 65, 66 years now? But that war created millions of refugees. A lot of South Koreans came to the United States. A lot of North Koreans went to China and other areas. Koreans went to Japan and other countries surrounding that area as well. Israel, there's a lot of political, there's a lot of politics involved in the state of Israel. Because after World War II, we just kind of created, the Allies created Israel out of nothing. There were people that lived there before, but the Allies just kind of got together, drew some lines, and said, okay, the Jewish people get to live here now. And all the people that lived there at the time were like, wait a minute, what about us? And whether you side with Israel or not, they have not done the best at treating the non-Jewish people of that area very well, and that creates a lot of refugees. And so they go to Jordan, they go to the places where they can live in Israel. They go to the surrounding countries a lot, or even further. The Vietnam War, very similar to Korea, North and South Vietnam started fighting each other. The Americans sided with the South, the Soviet Union sided with the North. It was just kind of a proxy war. The United States and Soviet Union didn't want to go to war against each other, so they fought these proxy wars where the Americans sided with one group and the Soviets sided with another, and we fought it out. And essentially, the Korean War was a stalemate. The Vietnam War, I mean, hate to say it, but we lost. And that created about 3 million refugees. And there's a famous photo here where American helicopters are trying to evacuate as many people as they can before the capital city of South Vietnam fell. And they evacuated out lots and lots and lots of people onto American naval vessels and brought a lot of them back to the United States. But even more had to flee across borders over land into surrounding countries. And then Afghanistan has been the site of almost continuous warfare for decades and decades and decades, because for a long time the Russians were fighting a war in Afghanistan, and that lasted a long time and created untold death and destruction. And then not that long after they left, of course, after September 11th, the United States started a war in Afghanistan, which, as of the recording of this video, is still ongoing. So they've seen just decades and decades and decades of almost continuous warfare, and that has created a lot of refugees. Some of them have gone to neighboring countries, some of them have come to the United States, some of them have gone to Europe. But it's created lots of people that had to flee Afghanistan because of this war, because of the Taliban, because of lots of different reasons. They've had to flee Afghanistan. So, the first slide in this section, I read off that quote. That's from the Universal Declaration of Human Rights in 1948. But remember, that doesn't have the force of law. That's just a declaration that says what countries should do. It has no actual force of law behind it. 1951, the UN got together and passed something that actually does have the force of international law behind it. And it essentially says that people have the right to resettlement. So if they're fleeing a country, you do not have the right to just kind of reject them out of hand, right? You can reject them for certain reasons, but you can't just say nobody. We're not allowing anybody. They get certain protections from deportation. If they can show that they have a legitimate fear of returning to their home country, you are legally barred by international law from deporting them. And they can't be penalized for entering the country illegally. So if they, if American government agents catch somebody in this country illegally and they say, yes, I'm here to apply for asylum or I'm here as a refugee, they can't be legally penalized for being here illegally, assuming they're actually a refugee or asylum seeker. But we're going to go ahead and end this subsection here. We'll be back in just a minute with the rest of this section.